Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for coming out tonight to engage me in this topic and have a little conversation after I've presented here. I know it's a very busy time of year everywhere, but especially on college campuses, and so you've carved out a little bit of time for this. I appreciate that very much, and it's a treat to be here. I've been on the other side of this as a reporter with my notebook going, and have covered a few events of the Church in the 21st Century project. So it's a treat to be in the line of speakers, if you will, and to share a few thoughts. As John just mentioned, I work in two capacities: as a freelance journalist with a religion specialty, as well as an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. And I've found in doing this work, working on this book, that there aren't that many people who do what I do in terms of having an opportunity to look at the religious landscape across the United States and try to make sense of it on an ongoing basis. A lot of folks in sociology of religion do great work, but they have to, by nature of their career, they have to focus on one area or another. So I've gotten into this, been doing this for a few years, and this book has grown out of the trends that I've seen. Tonight I'd like to share a few thoughts on some of these trends, some of the things that I've seen that concern me, and then also get into a bit of what might be a response from all people of the church. I focus in the book primarily on trends in American Protestantism, but there is a bit to say, and I'd be interested to hear about where some of this might apply in Catholic or other traditions too. It looks at first blush like the church in America is doing pretty well. I realize there are challenges out there. Certainly, we're all well aware of those facing the Catholic Church at this crossroads, and also, they're in the Protestant traditions. There's the mainline churches have seen their declines, but all things considered, in the big picture of things, the church in America is substantially more vibrant, it seems, than many of the churches in Europe. Just as one example, where the Gallup surveys say consistently that Americans still, more than 40% are in church on a weekly basis. More than 40%, which is substantial. Compare that to Europe, where 20% is considered high in certain countries. It's often less than 20% or even less than 10% are in church on a weekly basis in Europe. So we see that sort of religiosity being alive and well in the United States. Other signs seem to be encouraging too. With the mega churches, there seems to be a new model that has come on the scene, one that seems to have some staying power. There were only 310 mega churches in 1990, and by 2007 there were 1,250 in the United States. So tremendous growth in that model, as it seems to be meeting a need. In terms of donations, Americans give a little bit over $300 billion a year to charities of all types, and more than $100 billion of that goes to religious institutions. Almost $1 in $3 goes there. It's more than hospitals, it's more than education, it's more than any other type of philanthropy. So Americans are passionate and continue to support their religious institutions, and we've seen that these institutions have some muscle. We remember the role of the religious right in recent elections. We can see the role of the religious left in politics as well, such as with the passing of the increase in the federal minimum wage. The religious left was instrumental in that, which is another sign that we have some strength in these churches, and so it would seem that the church is alive and well and having a good, solid influence on American culture. But as I've looked into this a little further and scratched a bit, as I'm supposed to do as a reporter, the picture beneath the surface is not so rosy. The influence of the church is not only not really reaching the wider culture, as many in the church hope it will. The church is actually having a hard time influencing even the people in its most immediate sphere of influence. A few data points will help to illustrate this. One is that the Josephson Institute of Ethics in Los Angeles has done surveys of students in Christian schools and in secular schools. And they found that students in Christian schools are actually more likely to have cheated during their academic careers than those in secular schools. It's more than 70% of kids in the Christian schools say that they have cheated. And we can talk about why that might be. It seems to me that the reason the numbers are at least close to one another is that everybody feels pressure to achieve, and it would seem to me that that students in Christian schools are bowing to that pressure to say, look, it's not worth compromising my future. If I have to cheat a little here and there, I'll make up for it later. But there's a lot to talk about in that. In any event, it's an unsettling observation. I'll list a few more. Christians in America divorce at a rate of about 1 in 3, which is pretty high for a tradition that doesn't encourage or countenance divorce. The Christian financial counseling is alive and well. That there are, even before the financial crisis, there were a couple million who went only to Crown Financial Ministries. That was just one type of ministry that's been reaching out to Christians who have spent themselves into a hole. And I know that some people end up in debt for reasons beyond their control, medical disaster, and that sort of thing. But we're talking millions and millions of people who come from a tradition that believes that self-control is a gift of the Spirit in Galatians 5. And we're seeing in each of these categories that I'm listing a marked absence of self-control in the most basic areas of life. You know, just control over these things. We can talk about rates around food, for example, is another one. 75% of American clergy are either overweight or obese. And we can talk about pornography usage. There's data on that as well. And that comes close to 50% of Christians surveyed saying that that's a problem in their household. And I'll list one more, which is support for torture. The Pew Research Center has looked at this, has done surveys of Americans and who supports torture in certain cases with those who are suspected of terrorism. And then they slice and dice the data to see among the supporters who are they dealing with. When they get to Christians, they find a correlation between church-going attendance and support for torture. They see it most pronounced among white evangelicals. 79% say that torture is sometimes justified, but it's not as easy as just saying, yeah, that's folks far away in other parts of the country, or that's just a certain type of person. There's the Pew research people found that there was also 63% of mainline Protestants, those are the liberals, to put it into shorthand, feel the same way. And so this is another factor. The picture that I'm painting here is one of a church that is not reaching its people on this most primary level. And so as I find these things going on, I ask, why would this be the case? Why would a seemingly thriving institution be having so little impact on the most basic areas of life for its people? And to answer that question is to explore, I think, how the church, in some ways, some very concerning ways, is broken in America. That the church is, not having the impact that we would hope to have. And when we look more broadly, we sometimes will observe, wow, Christians sound awfully angry, and there's a lot of antipathy, and there's a lot of sort of unchristian behavior going on in public discourse, whether it's in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere, done in the name of Christ that doesn't look very Christ-like. And when we dig into it, it's not just an impression. There's some substance here to support our concern. To analyze it and make sense of it, I think we need to step back and see in the big picture what's happened to religion in America in the past 50 years. That's where I'd like to take you for a moment. When we go back to 1955, the Gallup poll asked Americans, have you ever in your life switched religious affiliations? And only 4% said yes. By 1985, it was 33%. And by 2008, it was 44% when the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life asked the question. So this tells us that something dramatic is happening. There's a sea change in the way Americans do religion, that there's a new kind of mobility, what I call a new religious marketplace, where we have a present competition for people. Call it competition for souls, if you like. It may have negative connotations, but however we slice it, Americans are increasingly willing to move about, to go somewhere else, and or to demand certain things of their institutions in a way that's very consumeristic. It seems that we are it's almost in the water that we drink and the air that we breathe as Americans, that we approach things as consumers. And we know how to do that really well, how to make your list of what you want and see how many things on my list can I get, and how can I pay as little as possible for those things. That works well in certainly at Costco or at Walmart. It works well at the flea market. It arguably may work well even in other sectors like higher education. But when it comes to the church, there is a difference where across the cultural landscape, these other institutions aim to satisfy desires, and that's how they stay in business. The church has a higher calling, which is to engage desires and elevate them, to elevate the things that people care about, to challenge people in a way you could put it as to transform desires, so that people care about things that they didn't care about when they were in the sandbox. The redemption of a hardened criminal, for instance, is not something that you care about when you're 2 and 3 years old. You have to learn to care about that. The welfare of a person who doesn't look like you or sound like you on the other side of the world isn't something that we just care about. You have to learn to care about it. And it seems that the church is commissioned to have that type of engagement with people, which involves something a little different from the most basic form of the consumer and business owner relationship. So there's something a little different that we're talking about. As this marketplace has emerged, our religious institutions have responded. They've been adapting in some interesting and dramatic ways. We see corporate marketing techniques coming out from the church. I wrote a series of stories earlier this decade that were looking at corporate marketing and in the church, writing, for instance, about denominations, my own, the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist Church, the Unitarian Universalist Church, all spending millions on advertising. This is mission budget that is being spent, handed to advertising agencies and to networks. That's who gets the money when you do that. And that's, not to try to judge that either way. That's their prerogative. But it's what my observation, though, is that churches are moving and trying to brand themselves. In some cases, trying to brand themselves over and against someone else. My own denomination, the UCC, in its campaigns, we call ourselves the church that they may all be one. That's our motto. And yet, going into these advertising campaigns, in one of them that you may remember with the bouncer, it was an ad that got a lot of attention. There was it depicted people of another church who were turning folks away because they were gay, or because they were of a racial minority, or because they were disabled. It was absurd. A depiction of, it was a caricature, really, of an unnamed church, but it just showed how far churches are bending and moving from their roots in order to distinguish themselves as a brand that would attract others. So this is some of what's happening around us. We see churches, we see institutions responding. And the point I want to make with this, to carry this portion a little farther, is that as our institutions are responding to market pressures, we're seeing the muscles of the church being eviscerated. The muscles for shaping character that are integral to our life in the church are not being exercised. On the contrary, they're being stripped of their power. And I want to give you a couple of specific examples, if I may, so you know what I'm talking about. One trend here is among niche churches and niches within churches. Within the megachurch, what we see is small groups organized so that folks are part of this big gathering of worship, but then there is a small group to which individuals plug in, 10 or 15 people who gather. And that is great for making connections and having a support there. What we're seeing, though, is increasingly these groups are organized among ever more niche categories of affinities. Affinity groups is what they're called. So that you go and you plug in not only to this big megachurch that's diverse, but you then the folks you really get to know within it are the others who are like you, a mother of kids who are under the age of 5, or a mid-career lawyer, or guys in their 30s who like to go running on Saturday mornings. Plugging in and getting to know folks so that you're connected with people who are really quite a bit like you. That's the idea, and it's done because it works. People like that. But there's something lost in this, and it's lost also on the level of when entire churches form for the sake of catering to a particular demographic niche, like, for instance, a church called Warehouse 242 down in Charlotte, North Carolina, which was spun off from another church in order to cater particularly to 20 and 30-something people. They wanted their own church, their own experience, and the elders of their parent church, the Forest Hill Church, felt that it would be good, it would be a good way to draw more people to the church if you could offer something so niche-y or so particularized. And so now we have that. So you have, you can bring your coffee and you can sit on couches and you can see clips of U2 played during the homily and be very comfortable with all the cultural elements. But it seems to me that something is lost when folks are no longer asked to worship alongside someone who is maybe 50 years your senior, who came of age in the Jim Crow South. That person's experience is no longer with you in the pew or with you when you're out serving in the community. That makes a difference. And when the church increasingly allows people to stay among those who are pretty much, very much like themselves, we're not really stretched to love those we thought were unlovable. So my point being that there's some pandering and some lack of challenge involved in all of this, as well as in the churches, the one in Irving, Texas, that caters only to motorcycle riders, the one in Las Vegas that caters only to people who love Hawaiian music. I can give you more examples if you'd like. Another category is around communion or the Lord's Supper, the sacrament in both Protestant and Catholic churches. It's the way that we receive communion is something you could think of it as kind of a wonky sort of subject, but I argue that there's something quite important about the way it's done. In Scripture, in 1 Corinthians, we hear Paul write that you're to approach the communion table with no divisions among you. In other words, to reconcile with those neighbors with whom you have acrimony or conflict. Before you come to the table, work those things out. If you can't work them out, abstain as a sign of respect for the sacrament, so that when you do partake, it's meaningful, as a sign that the body is united. That, I gather, I've heard that it still happens in some churches, that people still take that seriously, but I haven't seen it. I've covered dozens of services in recent years, and I never hear any call to take that seriously. When it's disregarded, that habit of going to someone with whom you have a real conflict and working it out doesn't get ingrained. So, unfortunately, what's lost is this practice of making amends, of taking a humble posture, of asking forgiveness, of giving forgiveness. None of that is cultivated in an intentional way week in and week out when this expectation is jettisoned. And so, as a result, Christians are not learning to be peacemakers. This virtuous trait is not actively cultivated week in and week out. And so, in my mind, if it's not expected when we come to the communion table or as a matter of preparation for that, it's not a big surprise when Christians go to Washington, D.C., or go on the talk shows, the call-in shows, or bring a call for war that may not be justified. These types of developments shouldn't be a huge surprise when the place for learning peacemaking is so neglected. I'll give you one more example in this category and then talk a little about what might be able to happen to respond to this environment. In the area of missions, there's some great work done in missions, and I want to make sure that folks hear me in the right way on this, that missions is often something that people engage in when they go overseas, something that people do with all the right intentions. 1.6 million Americans engage in overseas missions of the short-term variety, which means 2 weeks or less. This is one of the trends in American religion, is to do that, to go overseas and work on those projects. And there's even more who do it domestically on this short-term basis. What we see with this is there's been a number of agencies that have popped up to facilitate this type of thing. And the way then that they structure mission experiences are with the missionaries in mind. What will be life-changing for the missionaries? How will the missionaries have that experience, that sort of supreme experience? And what are the missionaries? Missionaries want to build. They want to go and they want to help and they want to see some concrete evidence that they've made a difference over a course of a few days. And so they're given opportunities to go and swing hammers and have something physical to point to at the end of the week. It's very satisfying. And to be sure, these things that missionaries build do improve people's lives sometimes. Not to take away from that, but I just want to acknowledge that that is in response to, it's as much in response to the missionaries' needs as it is to the needs of those in indigenous communities. And the other element is missionaries want to play. They go somewhere and they want to, do some work, but also have a good time. And so there's rafting trips that are worked in, and there's sightseeing that's added on. This is the structure of a short-term mission trip as it's marketed in American churches. A few days of work to feel good about, and then go off and play. There is not, in most cases, there's not an element built in to take time to listen to the people that you're serving, to get to know them, to spend time in their homes, to listen to the challenges that they have, to try to share in their feeling of helplessness, if that's what they feel at times, frustration with their circumstances. The idea of compassion, which in its basic element means to suffer with, is not present. And the reason it's not present, there's not a lot of suffering with the indigenous folks that they go to serve, is because the missionaries don't want it. It's not what they're asking for. And so it's not part of it anymore. That element, that dimension is purged. So what I'm giving you here is a picture. When we add all these things up, and there are many more in the book that I address, when we add all these up, what we see is that each area where hearts could be stretched to more fully reflect the heart of God, and where character can be formed, the muscles are just not being exercised. They're atrophying, and we could say that the tools are vanishing. I don't think that's too strong a term. And so what can be done in this environment? Folks could say a couple things. We could say, well, let's go back to another time. Let's go back to a simpler time, or let's roll back. I don't particularly think that's possible. I think that the religious consumerism genie is out of the bottle, and it's not going back. I think this is here, and I think people like in many ways, like the opportunity to influence the institution and to choose what they want in religious experience. I think it's appreciated, and so I think it's here to stay. The other is folks will say, well, hey, it's the market. This is what people want, so it's what's going to be. Just deal with it and be okay with it. And I am hopeful in these market dynamics. I think a lot of great things can come of it, as I'll explain in just a moment. Because, not because we just resign ourselves to it, but because we see in our time signs that markets can do good things. Think, for instance, of fair trade coffee and tea and sugar and all these other fair traded products. You roll back the clock, even, let's say, 20 years ago. Folks said, no one's ever going to buy that stuff. You're crazy. You're absolutely insane if you think someone's ever going to pay a little more for a coffee that was where someone in Central America was paid a little better wage for those beans. You've got to be kidding me. Well, sure enough now, there are a number of viable businesses that are catering exactly to that niche of people who do care. And the marketplace has responded to meet that need. We see it with lots of environmental products, any number of things that are easy on the environment that people choose largely for that reason. And it seems to me that there's a type of consumer out there who aims higher than to just try to get the most for the least. Think, for instance, of musicians or athletes. These are consumers of a type. When it comes time to hone their skills, they go into the marketplace and they pay, good hard cash for individuals who will help them develop their sport, develop their skills, and become great at those things. They don't shop for the one who's going to go easiest on them, the one who's going to make it as simple or uncostly as possible. They want the one who's going to really challenge and bring something great out of them. And I think religious consumers can be in that variety. I think religious consumers are just about ready to do that and to step up for that and seek something that's not religion as entertainment or religion as a soothing form of quasi-therapy that involves pandering or that involves platitudes. I think people want more depth and want some challenge, and I believe that on this niche-y landscape of religion, there's room for some niches that are going to bring these muscles back. There's room for a spiritual gymnasium out there, not just a spiritual cineplex, if you will. Allow me to stretch with a couple of metaphors there. How can it happen? I'll say a couple more things on this, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. In working on this book, you've heard some of the research on things that concern me. I also researched looking for some hope. And there's quite a bit out there. There are churches that are very much market-driven. There's one church, for instance, Church of the Abbey Way in Minnesota that I visited, that where people left the megachurch because they wanted more challenge and they wanted a higher expectation. And so now they adapt to spiritual disciplines. Everyone in the church wants to be praying the hours, for instance, which means that they have set prayers that they do morning, noon, and at the end of the day, as well as other spiritual disciplines that they do that sort of mark their life together. They've chosen a more robust life that works for them, and it's very much, in response to what they're looking for. Another church has small groups where people share, not just a little bit looking for encouragement, but will put out there some of their financial decisions and thinking about, I might buy I'm thinking about buying a $20,000 car, and they might be challenged to say, a $10,000 car would be fine for you. Maybe your funds could be, maybe the rest could go to another cause, and they at least have that conversation. These are just a couple of little examples, but the idea being that people are seeking some challenge that could be edifying, and they're doing it in a lot of different ways. And it's heartening to hear their stories. I won't go too far into it, but they're in the book, the stories of what's coming out of that impulse. And so, to wind it down here, I think this is an exciting time to be a Christian in America because our institutions are listening in a way that they haven't always listened to people in the pews. They're listening in part because they're scared of being irrelevant or dwindling. Preachers worry sometimes that a couple of controversial sermons and their flock is going to be half of what it used to be because leaving is so easy. In this environment, our institutions are responding, and so there's an opportunity to shape them. Lay people have an opportunity to shape our institutions in a way that just has not existed for a very long time. There is this opportunity, and there is this responsibility that comes with that, because there's no guarantee that 50 years from now the church is going to even have these muscles anymore. These instruments for shaping character are not upon us by edict in a way that they're permanently part of our lives as a culture. They could fade. If one or two generations says, I have no need for challenge in that way, it will disappear. And religion will become, the church will become sort of a quirky outpost of the entertainment industry. People will still go. We'll still have churches. People will still go, but it'll be a quirky form of entertainment that has kind of a soothing dimension to it. But that's a sad possibility. It seems that we can do much better, but we have to grab upon what's there. We have to claim the tradition and claim dimensions of it for character shaping, because there is so much at stake. Whether we pass things on to another generation is at stake, whether our civilization is strong enough to be grounded when we consider that some of the threats come from people who are willing to die, some of the extremists who are willing to die for the things that they believe in. And we think about where spirituality is going in many of our churches, and folks are hesitant to experience even the slightest bit of discomfort. That's a sobering contrast. And lastly, we care about each other, and there are many temptations in our world that require strength and backbone and character to resist. We just need to have a place, in my opinion, where folks can go and be strengthened in the ways that allow them to thrive as human beings in a world that's just rife with temptations that ruin lives. And we owe it. We've inherited this great spiritual tradition, and we owe it to one another and to those who come after us to embrace it and pass it on. I think I'll stop there.